After years of pain, I confronted my ex at the family reunion, and you won't believe his reaction. Maria Silva stood just outside the crowded living room where her family reunion had already taken off without her, clutching the strap of her faded purse a little tighter as she fought the sudden surge of nerves twisting her stomach. The old house smelled of baked chicken and powdered sugar, comfort foods that had marked every family gathering since she was a child. But tonight, the familiar warmth felt like an icy wall pressing against her chest. The laughter spilling from inside collided with the tight silence she'd carried within for years. This was the moment she had dreaded, yet somehow, after all this time, she stood at the threshold bravely trying not to run back to the safety of her small apartment 2 blocks away. Today was different, not just any reunion. Today, she would confront James. Her heart slammed sharper than a hammer with every thought about him. Not the James everyone remembered, the charming one with a quick smile and easy jokes, but the James who had shattered her quietly, thread by delicate thread, until she almost forgot how to believe in herself. It wasn't some big dramatic scene people talked about. To others, it was invisible. But inside her, each cruel word he'd thrown, every cold dismissal, every moment she was publicly belittled, remained like scars etched on her soul. She remembered the last family reunion like it happened yesterday, how he had laughed across the room when her shaky glass slipped and shattered on the floor, how no one had come to help her, not even him, who was supposed to care. They saw her as a weak girl who'd made bad choices. What they didn't know was how deeply she had suffered alone. Taking a shaky breath, Maria pushed open the door and stepped inside. Heat and voices wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket, but she forced herself to keep moving forward. She caught sight of her cousin Anna near the kitchen, gripping a plate overloaded with mashed potatoes, and gave her a small nod. Anna waved back with a sympathetic smile, which was the first hint of kindness Maria had felt in a long time tonight. But then her gaze found James. He was there by the window, dressed casually but with the same smug expression on his face, a mask to hide what he hoped was indifference. Their eyes locked. For a heartbeat, neither looked away. In his glance, Maria saw the flicker of surprise but quickly replaced with arrogance. She swallowed the lump in her throat, feeling the heat rise to her cheeks. The family chatter dimmed at her awareness that some eyes were turning to her, curious, judgmental, cautious. She could almost hear the whisper running through the room, "Look, it's Maria. Wonder why she came." The unfairness of it all sliced through her like a blade. How many times had she replayed this moment in her head? How many times she wished she had the voice to say what needed to be said, to break free from the silence that had bound her. As her fingers nervously trembled against the hem of her sweater, a quiet voice inside pushed her forward. Not today. Today, she would not be the girl they thought she'd always be. Could she really do it? Call out the pain. Face the shame. Be vulnerable in front of all those eyes? The room felt like it was shrinking and expanding all at once, a storm of doubt and courage battling within her. Maria's breath quivered, but her steps found steadiness as she joined the small circle near the dining table. She could feel the weight of memories hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. Still, with every beat of her heart, she gathered strength, because some stories need to be told, and some pain refuses to fade without being faced. Have you ever felt that moment when fear and hope collide, the exact second you decide to stand up for yourself despite everything? What would it take for you to confront someone who had hurt you deeply, knowing it might change everything? Maria wasn't sure yet if she had all the answers, but something in her whispered that the night still held its secrets. The atmosphere inside the old house was thick with tension, though few seemed to notice. Maria's every step seemed heavier now, weighted down not just by the crowded room but by the invisible chains of judgment and memories she was dragging behind her. James hadn't moved from the window, but his gaze followed her with something sharp beneath the surface. Amusement? Contempt? Whatever it was, it sent a shiver down her spine, mixing shame with a growing spark of defiance. She found herself near the kitchen again, where her younger cousin Lily was chatting casually with a group of relatives. Maria caught snippets of their laughter, not warm and welcoming but the kind that felt like it had corners built to hide whispered comments. As she passed by, she heard someone mutter, "Look who's back." Thought she wouldn't show her face. Wonder if she's here to cry again. The words stung like ice against her skin, and hot tears blurred her vision for a moment. She blinked rapidly, forcing the tears back. Not now. Not here. James' voice cut through her inner storm suddenly, loud enough for those close to hear. "Well, if it isn't little Maria, all grown up and still playing victim." His smirk was slow and cruel, his words carrying years of condescension. A hush fell over the nearby crowd. Maria felt every pair of eyes burning into her, some brimming with pity, others barely hiding disdain. Her heart pounded. She could feel her entire body trembling, a mix of humiliation and anger bubbling up inside like a cauldron ready to boil over. The memory of the last reunion flashed violently in her mind, how James had publicly mocked her when she dared to speak about her dreams, how he belittled her ambitions with a casual cruelty that left her gasping for air. The laughter that followed crushed her like 1,000 tiny nails. That day, she had picked up the shattered pieces of her confidence alone, retreating farther into herself with each passing year. And now, here she was again, facing the same man who had made her feel small and worthless in front of people who should have protected her. A voice from her uncle, sitting nearby, whispered sharply enough for her to hear but without hiding his disdain, "Some wounds just don't heal. Maybe she should stop dragging this past around and move on." The words rang viciously in the stagnant air, a public reminder that her struggle was invisible to those who chose not to see. At that moment, the room felt simultaneously suffocating and cold, like a stage where every humiliating act she endured had been choreographed for all to witness. Maria's knees nearly buckled, but she stiffened her spine. Anger flared in her chest, fierce and consuming. How many times had she been told to just forget it, get over it, or stop being so sensitive? None of those empty platitudes had ever touched the raw ache within. Tears threatened again, but this time she clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms as if to pull herself out of the sinking pit. She wasn't just some broken girl. She was a woman who had survived storms they would never understand. She swallowed hard and took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the eyes of her family shift once more, their expressions a tangled mix of expectation and curiosity. James' smirk faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in his carefully constructed armor. Yet the whispers continued, some louder now, some sneering, some hesitant. Maria felt the weight of years pressing down on her chest, the bitterness of isolation mingling cruelly with the faintest spark of resolve. Despite everything threatening to pull her under, something inside her refused to be silenced any longer. The quiet strength she once thought lost had begun to glow quietly beneath the surface, ready to break free. She wasn't sure what would happen next or how her family would react, but the moment was charged with possibility. The question lingered in the air as thick as the tension. They all waited silently for Maria to speak. Would she break? Or would she finally reclaim her voice and shatter the silence that had caged her? Have you ever faced a moment when the world feels against you, and every breath weighs 1,000 pounds? How do you find the courage to stand up when the whispers feel louder than your own heartbeat? Maria was at that crossroads now, teetering between the past she'd endured and the uncertain future she dared to imagine. The room held its breath, ready for what would come next. Maria retreated momentarily to the edge of the room, her chest heaving as she tried to steady the storm raging inside her. The faces around her blurred into a haze of judgment and pity, voices still whispering behind her back like an unrelenting tide. Each whispered doubt, every side glance felt like another nail driven into the fragile coffin of her self-worth. She felt utterly exposed, as if her past mistakes and pain were written across her skin, displayed for all to scrutinize and dismiss. With a shaky sigh, she sank onto a battered wooden chair near the faded floral wallpaper, the creaking sound surprisingly loud in the silence that had settled around her. The room's warmth seemed distant, her fingers tingled as they gripped the edges of her worn sleeves. Her mind reeled with the chorus of blame she'd internalized over the years. How many times had she whispered it's my fault in the quiet hours of the night? How often had she replayed the moments where she wished she had shouted back, stood firm, or simply walked away before the damage settled so deeply in her bones? The ghosts of shame and humiliation clung to her like a second skin, and even now, amid familiar faces, she felt achingly alone. Yet, amid the suffocating weight of doubt, a small spark flickered. Anna, her cousin who had given her that encouraging nod earlier, quietly slid onto the chair beside her without a word. Her presence was a balm, a subtle promise that Maria wasn't entirely alone in this. Anna's hand brushed lightly over Maria's, grounding her. "You're stronger than you think," she whispered, voice steady but gentle. "Everyone here has their own battles. Some just hide theirs better." The words were simple, yet they carried a lifeline Maria desperately needed. With Anna's quiet support, Maria felt a fragile hope stirring within her heart. If others had endured pain and come through it, perhaps she could do the same. But even as that hope took root, the shadows of self-doubt crept back. How to rebuild when every step seemed haunted by the fear of judgment? How to reclaim a voice that had been silenced for so long? Questions swarmed her mind, relentless and unforgiving. From the corner of her eye, Maria caught her younger cousin Daniel fiddling awkwardly with a napkin. His innocence, untouched yet by the attitudes corrupting the adults around them, offered an unspoken reminder of the future she wanted, for herself and for those who looked up to her silently. Maybe the courage to speak wasn't about grand declarations, maybe it was about one small, truthful step taken in spite of fear. Could she find that courage? Suddenly, James approached, his stride deliberate but less confident than before. His gaze no longer smug but conflicted, betraying the image he tried so hard to project. "Maria," he began, voice low and cool, "maybe this isn't the place for what you want to say. You're making a scene." The words hung heavy, laden with the subtle thread of shame designed to keep her silent. Maria looked up, feeling the fire within her flicker brightly despite the chill his tone brought. No longer the trembling girl who had almost fled hours ago, she met his gaze steadily. "Maybe it's exactly the place," she replied softly but firmly. "Maybe it's time the things I've carried quietly for years are no longer hidden." A hush fell around them. The air thick with anticipation, several relatives shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch. The weight of years pressed in, but Maria's resolve held firm. She was tired of erasing her own story to make others comfortable. This was her moment to start something new, painful, yes, but necessary. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the hurt and fear, a quiet voice whispered courage. The battle wasn't over, but the first move had been made. Have you ever felt that fragile moment when you're caught between retreating into silence and breaking free with your truth? How do you withstand the voices that try to silence your pain? Maria's journey was far from over, but with every breath, she inched closer to reclaiming herself, one brave word at a time. The room held its breath as Maria's words echoed softly but resolutely, vibrating through the space like a call to attention no one could ignore. For a fleeting second, James' face froze, his usual arrogance dissolving into a flicker of something raw and vulnerable. The arrogance that had cloaked him like armor was cracked just enough for the sharp edges of guilt and regret to peek through, although he fought fiercely to smother them beneath a mask of indifference. The family members exchanged uneasy glances, the air thrummed with the electric tension of a story about to unfold that no one had dared to confront before. Maria could feel the overwhelming weight of the moment tightening around her chest, like a vice squeezing out all the breath she had left. Deep down, she knew this would be the hardest part, the unveiling of years of hurt and whispered embarrassments, all laid bare in front of those who'd stood silent or looked away. But the truth was a flame she could no longer keep locked away in the darkness of her soul. Suddenly, an elderly voice spoke from the far side of the room, quiet but carrying an undeniable strength. "Maria, darling, it's time you told them. We all have stories, some darker than others." It was Aunt Rose, a woman usually reserved, often overlooked, but whose eyes now shone with fierce compassion. She rose slowly, steady on her feet despite her age, and with a trembling hand she reached for Maria's. I've watched you suffer quietly, and while I couldn't fully understand, I want you to know you're not alone. The room fell into a hush, even the youngest children paused in their playing, sensing the gravity. The unexpected alliance sparked a ripple of murmurs, the kind of empathy that comes when others realize their own pain is mirrored in another's story. Aunt Rosa's words opened a door that had been sealed tight for too long. It was as if a dam had cracked, and behind it poured forth waves of shared experiences long buried beneath the surface of polite smiles and avoiding gazes. Moved by the moment, Aunt Rose began to share a story of her own, a tale of hardship and heartbreak that no one in the family knew, a secret struggle with loss and feeling invisible in her own youth. Tears shone in her eyes as she spoke, but strength had replaced bitterness, and her voice was steady. I, too, was once that frightened girl, ashamed and silenced. But time lent me strength, and courage grew from pain. Her words wrapped around Maria like a warm embrace, offering more than sympathy, it was a beacon of hope. James shifted uncomfortably, his composure unraveling as the attention turned away from him toward the stories of resilience unfolding in front of him. He seemed blindsided, maybe even chastened, though he didn't utter a word. The once mocking crowd now wore faces softened by understanding and reflection, many nodding slowly as if a veil had been lifted that made their own judgments seem shallow and cruel. Tears lined Maria's eyes, but they were no longer tears of shame, they were tears of relief, of release. The years of carrying invisible burdens suddenly felt lighter, as though unpacked pieces of her past could now find rest. For the first time, she saw that her pain and her journey mattered, not just to herself but to those around her. The family, too, had been prisoners of silence, but now that barrier was crumbling. Still clutching Aunt Rosa's hand, Maria straightened her back and looked around with quiet determination. The room was no longer an arena of judgment but a space where truth and healing could begin. Hope flickered in her chest, a fragile but powerful promise that redemption was possible even after years of pain. Could one moment, one brave confession, unravel years of hidden agony and breathe life back into a broken soul? Maria and her family were about to discover that reconciliation doesn't come without discomfort, but it also brings profound transformation. Have you ever witnessed someone breaking free from chains you thought were unbreakable? What kind of strength does it take to turn pain into a bridge rather than a barrier? Maria had crossed the threshold tonight, and whatever came next, nothing would ever be the same again. The family reunion had shifted from a gathering of silent suffering to a turning point, a shared beginning toward healing. The air in the room thickened with a charged stillness as Maria's revelation settled like a fragile shell over the gathered family members. Eyes that had once held judgment now brimmed with a mix of shame, empathy, and stunned silence. For the first time in years, the veneer of casual politeness cracked wide open, exposing the raw, uncomfortable truth that no one could ignore. James stood frozen, his usual swagger diminished, as the weight of his actions pressed down on him in full view of those who'd silently witnessed the damage he'd inflicted. Maria straightened her shoulders, stepping forward with a newfound steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. The years of internalized pain, the whispered taunts, the dismissive smirks, the isolation, had been brought into the light, and with them, a demand for accountability. For so long, she began, voice clear and unwavering, I carried the shame you tried to bury me in. I stayed silent because I thought it was easier than the fight. But silence only made me smaller. Her eyes glistened but did not waver. No more. I'm done shrinking for the comfort of others. A murmur spread through the room, a swelling tide of support from relatives who had hesitated to speak yet felt the courage welling inside the atmosphere. Aunt Rosa's presence beside Maria was a sturdy anchor, an unspoken signal that the family's old dynamics were shifting. Faces softened, shoulders relaxed, and a subtle warmth replaced the cold distance that had long held them apart. James's expression flickered with desperation. He attempted to speak, stammering at first, Maria, but the words caught in his throat, drowned by the collective gaze now focused firmly on him. His arrogance was dismantled piece by piece, stripped bare in front of people who once admired him, now quietly disappointed. The man who had wielded control like a weapon found himself powerless, forced to confront the consequences that had long been ignored. In a decisive moment, Maria looked around the room, locking eyes with those who had doubted and whispered behind her back. "This isn't about revenge," she said softly, "it's about truth and healing. And with that comes responsibility." Some nodded slowly, others wiped away tears quietly, and a few offered tentative smiles that spoke volumes. The strength of this shared acknowledgement rippled through the room with palpable energy. By the time the evening shadows lengthened, the family reunion had transformed. Conversations flowed with newfound honesty, stories once buried shared with gentle respect. Old wounds began to stitch together with compassionate hands. James, meanwhile, retreated into himself, a humbled figure wrestling with the reality he'd long avoided. He was no longer the antagonist cloaked in arrogance, the walls around him were crumbling. Maria's heart swelled with a complex blend of relief and empowerment. She had faced her past, spoken her truth, and witnessed the beginning of real change, not just within herself but within a family that had long been fractured by silence and misunderstanding. The journey ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time, it seemed navigable. Have you ever stood in a moment where justice was less about punishment and more about transformation? When the courageous act of speaking the truth shifts not just the narrative, but the people involved? Maria's confrontation was neither perfect nor painless, but it was real, and in its rawness lay the power to heal old scars and open new paths forward. This wasn't the end of her story, but it was the moment she stopped being a shadow and started being the light for herself and those who might walk beside her. The family reunion would be remembered not for the pain it once held, but for the courage that turned it into a story of redemption and hope. The following days after the reunion unfolded like the gentle dawn after a long, stormy night, soft light filtering through broken clouds, promising renewal. Maria woke with a quiet sense of peace she'd never known, as if the heavy chains of fear and shame had finally loosened their grip. Her reflection in the mirror showed more than just the woman who had endured, it revealed resilience carved into the lines of her face and a spark in her eyes born from hard-fought freedom. The small apartment that once felt like a sanctuary turned prison now felt like a place where she could rebuild. Every breath was a testament to the strength she had reclaimed. Though the path ahead wasn't smooth, old wounds still stung and conversations with family continued to be delicate, the shift in the air was undeniable. She found herself embraced by relatives who once kept their distance, offered words of comfort and encouragement she never expected. Even James, in his own hesitant way, approached her for moments of tentative dialogue, no longer masking his remorse with cruelty but stumbling through the awkwardness of accountability. It was not an erasure of the past, but a recognition that forgiveness and healing were choices they could work toward, painfully, imperfectly, but earnestly. Maria's courage had become a mirror reflecting back to her family the power of vulnerability and truth. Through her, they saw that healing is not about perfection or forgetting, but facing pain head-on and choosing growth instead. Aunt Rose remained a steadfast ally, often reminding her, "You lit the way for all of us, love." Sometimes one brave soul breaks the silence and changes the whole story. Those words became a mantra, one she carried into every interaction, every decision, every moment of doubt. Because beyond the reunion, beyond the confrontation and whispered apologies, Maria understood the greatest transformation had happened inside herself. She was no longer the quiet, hurting girl who dreaded every family gathering. She was a woman who dared to confront her fears, who refused to be defined by others' cruelty. Her worth was no longer tied to past humiliation but cemented firmly in her courage to reclaim her narrative. Looking back, Maria realized that true strength is often born in the rawest moments of vulnerability. The pain she endured had shaped her, but it did not have the power to imprison her anymore. She had learned that confronting one's past, even when it feels impossible, can illuminate a future filled with hope, dignity, and love. And in doing so, one voice can inspire many others to begin their own journey toward healing. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button. See you in our next story.